Nick, I am so honored that you're here today. I am honestly fangirling quite a bit, so thank you sincerely for joining us.
Lovely to see you, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. To jump right into it, it's funny to admit this because it does run a bit counter to the general ethos of this episode that no, rich people are not inherently better, smarter, more qualified just because they have money. But I do find your point of view on these things credible explicitly because you have been the beneficiary in the past of the neoliberal capitalist model that you point to as being problematic. Can you explain what neoliberalism means, like in simple terms? Why are rich people so much richer today? How come a Fortune 500 CEO makes more than 300 times what their average worker earns? Where did we go wrong, Nick?
Yeah, so it's a great question, but does have a somewhat complex answer. So neoliberalism is the label that we put on a very particular kind of economic reasoning that has dominated policymaking for the last 40 or 50 years, really since the mid-70s, early 80s. And it is linked to the sort of prevailing orthodox economics that is taught in universities and that everybody learns pretty much. And that economics you can call neoclassical economics. But anyway, it's a framework of thought that is based on a bunch of idealized assumptions about human behavior, about the origins and nature of prosperity, about the dynamics of human social systems, about the sources and causes of economic growth, and so on and so forth. They weren't maliciously created, but they were idealized. And these assumptions undergird this framework of thought that is internally consistent. It is mathematically elegant, but it is completely untethered from anything that actually happens on planet Earth, because all of those assumptions are just objectively false. One of the assumptions is that people are what's called homo economicus, which is reliably selfish and rational. And that turns out just to be factually incorrect. People are actually not inherently selfish. We're groupish, other-regarding, innately moral, and cooperative, mostly, although we can be selfish and awful. Another assumption is that the economy is what's called the Pareto optimal equilibrium. That also is false. The economy isn't in equilibrium or an equilibrium system at all. It's an open, complex, adaptive ecology. The idea that price equals value and that growth is the product of factors of production. All of these things are plausible. They're tractable with mathematics, but they're just not true. And it would be bad if they were just not true, but makes them truly awful is that if you take these assumptions seriously, if you just make policy on the basis of them, there is really only one outcome which is possible, and that is that the rich will get richer and everyone else will get poorer. And let me give you just two quick examples, if I can. So one of the baseline assumptions of orthodox economic thinking is this idea that the economy is this Pareto optimal equilibrium within which basically it's an equilibrium system within which if anything from the outside changes it destroys the efficiency of the system. So in other words, if one thing goes up, another thing must go down within this way of thinking. So for example, if wages go up for low wage workers, then using this logic, it has to be true by definition that the number of jobs will go down. And that would be true if the economy was a Pareto optimal equilibrium. It's just that it's not. It's an open ecology, and claiming that when wages rise, jobs decrease would be like claiming that when plants grow, animals shrink. It's just not the way the system works. And so all of these idealist assumptions were, over decades, weaponized into what has essentially become a protection racket for the rich. And the sad part is that because this is what everybody learned in college, Republicans and Democrats, policymakers from both parties implemented legislation and enacted policies on the basis of this thinking, which resulted in this massive transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% of Americans to the top 1%. And that is the big problem. So that's what neoliberalism is this way of thinking about economic cause and effect that leads you to believe, among other things, that if you raise wages, it kills jobs, and therefore you should never do that, and that tax cuts for the rich create growth, so you should always do that, and that any form of constraint or regulation on corporations will reduce their efficiency and productivity and will be bad for everybody, and so on and so forth, sort of the trickle-down playbook. And none of this turns out to be true. It's all nonsense.
Totally. You've said another, I've heard you, I think it might have been the TED Talk that you did where you had mentioned, like, not only are these things wrong, but they're just backwards, but they're so insidiously baked into the framework of our politics and our economics that you challenge them and you're immediately met with this idea of like, well, it's Econ 101 that these things are true. And it's like, well, but if Econ 101 was wrong, then where does that leave us? And you had mentioned something in your answer that I wanted to kind of dig a little bit deeper in because it stood out to me quite a bit. So when you say that modern economics, it's based on this theory, people are inherently selfish, inherently rational actors, they're motivated by self-serving incentives. And you're pointing out that no, actually, the anthropological perspective of human nature and incentives says the opposite. Humans are not inherently self-serving. Yeah. They are actually biologically wired to be cooperative, to participate in a collective. How does that finding or correction change what we believe to be true about what makes markets work best? Yeah, that's a terrific question too, and right at the heart of where we went wrong. So I think to answer that question, the first thing to try to understand is what prosperity actually is. And the conventional view is that it's best represented by money or GDP or something else like that. And that also is not true. It's a convenient way to look at it, but it's not true in any meaningful sense. Prosperity in human societies is best understood as the accumulation of solutions to human problems. And the difference between a poor society and a wealthy one isn't the difference in the amount of money kicking around. It's the degree to which that society has solved the problems facing its citizens. And so in a primitive society, maybe you get a hammock and some bananas, and if you get sick, you're on your own. In an advanced society, you have a comfy bed and air conditioning, and if you get sick, there's antibiotics available, and so on and so forth. And so if you understand prosperity as the accumulation of solutions to human problems, then you can see that the point of the economy, and in fact the reason that markets are a positive social technology is it enables groups of people to come together to solve increasingly complex problems. And that process is all based on cooperation. The competition actually plays an exceedingly small role in producing the things that improve our welfare. And once you understand that, and you merge that with effectively, as you put it, the anthropological fact that humans were wired to be cooperative, you can see that cooperation is our superpower, not this sociopathic competitive thing that neoliberalism and sort of the modern take on capitalism insists. And as I've said before,
being rapacious doesn't make you a capitalist. It makes you a sociopath and an asshole. Markets can create competition is an indispensable part of a functioning market, but cooperation is the thing that makes it go and is the source of all of the cool new things that functioning economy can produce to make people's lives better. And so what we should be encouraging is more cooperation and not necessarily people being ever more competitive. Does that hold together?
Absolutely.
For you?
Totally. Thank you. I appreciate that. I also wonder if it maybe is what's happening here with, I wanted to ask you about this idea that everything should be a market, right? Like I heard you and Oren Cass in an interview on your show Pitchfork Economics talking about how not everything should be a market, that a free market is not a solution to all of our problems. And I was immediately reminded of how ridiculous and indefensible it is that we have for-profit health insurance marketplaces in the United States, because not only is it dystopian from a human perspective, but it actually ends up being less efficient, more expensive, and crucially results in less consumer choice than a single payer model would because of the in-network, out-of-network racket. To me, this is like the quintessential example. But I find that this assertion that a free market is not always the best solution defies that conventional economic wisdom, because most of us just assume that the best, most efficient way to run anything is with a market. It's Econ 101, right? Can you speak to this a little bit more? Like, why is a private market not always in the public's best interest?
Yeah. So Katie, I think you're really onto something there and are correct. So again, the conventional neoliberal view of markets is that they are efficient, that they efficiently allocate scarce resources, and that is the source of of how they create value in the world. And that is objectively false. Markets are not efficient at all. 85% of all businesses fail within a year and a half. Markets, like Microsoft bought one of my companies for $6.5 billion and destroyed 100% of the value within 24 months. There's nothing efficient about that. But what markets are superb at, unmatched at, is effectively evolving new solutions to human problems. So markets are not efficient, but can be incredibly effective if well constructed and well managed. And so there are some circumstances in a human society where that, and by the way, they're evolutionary processes, where that evolutionary dynamic can be insanely useful. So a market works super well if you have, for example, a whole bunch of companies, which are essentially independent organisms, cooperating to compete to find for example, a new way to inoculate people against a pandemic, right? Very
relevant example.
That's the canonical example of like when markets really work great. But private health insurance, for example, is a great example of where markets do not work, because when you put private insurers in between doctors and patients for every healthcare transaction, from the most mundane to the most serious, like from burning a wart off your pinky to brain cancer, what you have effectively done is created an incentive within the healthcare system to turn molehills into mountains. Because if the intermediary makes 15 or 20% on every transaction, well, guess what? You want to make every transaction an expensive transaction, right? Yeah. Without creating any value. Like, why in the world do you need an insurance company to be the payer if you go to the doctor and get a wart burned off your pinky? This is just nuts, right? and so this is a great example of where a public institution like a single payer system could both drop that transaction charge from, let's call it 15 or 20% of every medical, of the average medical transaction cost, plus remove the incentive to turn everything that's cheap and easy and inexpensive into something which is expensive and hard to do and bills a lot. And this is why the United States spends approximately twice as much per citizen per year on healthcare as all of the countries in the world that have single-payer systems, where they have gotten rid of this abomination, right? And so what we've done in the United States in the interest of serving the neoliberal efficiency gods is created a healthcare system which effectively is the world's biggest price-fixing scheme, right? It's just this insane, nutty system, which, by the way, has some good parts. Look, our pharmaceutical, like that whole industry is super corrupt and charges too much and blah 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 blah. But we are pretty innovative here and have come up with some pretty great stuff to make people's health better. So it's not all bad. But you're exactly right, is that there are these places where markets can create enormous social value and places where they just do not belong at all. And again, the neoliberal view that everyone, it looks at everyone as a sociopath, right? That's the problem with Homo economicus, is if you take it seriously, then you cannot permit the possibility that there are groups of people who want to do the right thing just because it's the right thing and they care about other people. That's impossible in that world. And so it reduces, for example, every worker in the government to this self-interested jerk who's just trying to make things worse for everyone. And, and school systems, the whole thing is it's nuts. And it's just not true. That's just not what people are like. And, although people can be awful, but anyway, so you're dead right.
Well, I would like to talk to you a little bit about another thing that I kind of group in with healthcare from a human need perspective, and that is shelter. One of the biggest problems facing American cities today is a lack of affordable housing. And you wrote that across America, housing costs have been rising faster than incomes for decades, with every $100 increase in median rent generating a staggering 15% increase in homelessness. And you say trickle-down economics is to blame here as well. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, well, this is a classic instantiation of where the market failed, right? And the housing problem is a very, very complicated problem, but the market solves the market is organized not to solve problems the society faces. It's under the neoliberal conception, the only point of the market is to enrich shareholders, and often the activities involved in enriching shareholders have almost nothing to do with solving the problems the society faces. I think that the country needs to approach housing like we approach transportation a little bit more. We need to invest collectively in building housing that people can afford. And the great thing about when we built we built the national highway system, right, a long time ago as a country. And we paid for it and have amortized it over decades and decades and decades. But imagine if that highway system was owned by private interests, and every year they jacked up the rates that we all had to pay to drive from one place to another. How horrific that would be, instead of just driving on the roads. Well, this is what happens in the housing thing, is that if all of the housing is owned by private interests, when the market gets good, well, rates go up, but prices to build, rents go up, so on and so forth. But imagine if instead the country had built a huge amount of middle class housing in cities around the country, and the public owned it like they do the roads. And instead of jacking up the rates every year, we simply charged people the amount that it took to maintain those houses over decades. So then the country would have this. This is not to say you want to outlaw private housing. Fine, build it. But if we had spent some fraction of what we spent on transportation, on housing in the places where everybody's living, and the public owned it and people rented it for what it cost to build, not what some private equity firm can charge you by owning it, well, then we wouldn't have a housing crisis. And by the way, this is not I'm not imagining this scenario. This is what places that have solved this problem have done. That's what they did. And the only bad part about this approach, of course, is that it's very difficult to solve today's problem quickly. Do you know what
Totally.
Do you see what I mean? You have to do this over time.
It takes time. Yeah. And massive investment. Well, it's funny too, because it's a give a public sector option, right, for these things that are necessary. It's not saying you can't have the private sector too, but it's funny because when we did an episode a couple weeks ago about kind of the bootstrapping, rugged individualist ideology in the US, and that if you can't do all of these things for yourself, the government's not there to save you and that they're not there to help you, which, okay, first of all, yes, they are. That's literally the point of the government. But there was one kind of piece of criticism that stuck out to me because someone was like, well, it's not good to be so individually reliant on anyone. And I was like, bingo, it's not good to be individually reliant on anything. And right now in our current system, we've granted so much personhood to these corporations. You're individually reliant on your employer, who probably employs you at will, which means they can terminate you whenever they want. Right. Taking with them your income, your health insurance, and obviously the income is what you use to pay for the skyrocketing cost of housing, childcare, all of these things. So I agree we should not be individually reliant on any one thing, but that's frankly the system that we have right now. So bit of a soapbox, but all that to say, I am in complete agreement. And I think this is a great segue to middle out economics and policy. And, middle out economics, this is your baby. You coined this term. And it basically says growth in an economy actually happens from the working class up and the middle class out. It is basically the antithesis of trickle-down economics. I was listening to your new episode that came out about how important this narrative is to creating systemic change. This idea that middle-out policies have to be framed accurately to get the buy-in they need, that they are intended to right the scales, if you will, of an economic and political system that has for decades prioritized the super rich at the expense of everyone else. And that it's not the government as savior. The government is not here to save you, but rather the idea that the government should adequately support working and middle class Americans so they can benefit more fairly from the hard work they are already doing, as opposed to what it's doing right now, which is actively working against them. That is a brilliant distinction to make. How does middle out economics work? Can you give us some examples of middle out economic policies?
Sure, but I want to zoom out just a tiny bit, and cover some stuff that you said that I thought was really important. And one of them is, again, that people have been so brainwashed by neoliberalism, and one of the anchor ideas is that that markets are really efficient, perfectly efficient, and basically reward everybody in proportion to what they contribute, right? So if you're rich, you deserve to be rich, and if you're poor, you deserve to be poor. And all of that is, it's not complete nonsense, because of course there are lots of examples of people who are rich, who are extraordinarily talented and insanely hardworking. Merit has something to do with this, but one of the most profound mistakes of the conventional economics is this idea that path-dependent luck and compounding don't have anything to do with where we're at in society, and that is super, 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 super false. the game of life is not like checkers, where sort of everybody starts out the same. And if you're good at checkers, you win. And if you're bad at checkers, you lose. It's like Monopoly, where the only outcome that is possible is one person will win all the money and everyone else will go bankrupt in the absence of countermeasures.
Jeff Bezos has entered the chat.
And actually, yeah. No, exactly. You know, like that's the thing about a market economy, is that it naturally, inevitably it compounds both advantages and disadvantages over time. And what that means is that the middle classes are always deliberate artificial constructions. They don't happen. They're not the happy byproduct of economic growth. They must be the objective of policy. And so there's a reason that there's been this $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. That's not because the bottom 90% slacked off over the last 40 years. It's because we allowed policies to concentrate advantages and disadvantages, and we didn't used to do that. And so middle out economics takes that into account and basically is a deliberate effort to generate prosperity by ensuring that every citizen is robustly included in the economy as a consumer, as an innovator, as a citizen, so on and so forth, because that is what makes the economy go. The economy is people. It's not money.
You don't say.
The economy is people. Yeah. And the more people we robustly include in the economy, the better it will work. Full stop. This is the golden rule of economics. Inclusion is not this thing, this sort of liberal nicety that we should do if and when we have economic growth. Including people is the cause of economic progress in market economies. And so middle out economics is all about getting everyone in the country to be able to robustly participate in as many ways as possible, whether as consumers with rising incomes or as highly trained workers or innovators making cool new things to solve human problems. And it's effectively the opposite of the trickle-down approach, which was simply if you just give enough tax cuts to rich people, somehow it will all work out for everybody, which is always a con job and nonsense. And so that's I mean, you know, you could go on and on and on about what the policies of middle-out economics are. They include things like making sure that every single person who works for a company, particularly a big company, earns enough to live a dignified and secure life without the assistance of other taxpayers, right? Mm-hmm. Like if a company cannot afford to pay its people enough to get by without food stamps, it's not really a company, it's a parasite. So it should go away or figure out a way to pay people enough to get to live like decently. And so, you know, there's a billion things you would do, but all of them are aimed at making sure that every citizen gets to participate. And, you know, when you do that, everything works. The rate of economic progress increases. The amount of polarization in the society massively decreases. And Katie, this is something we should really talk about, is that, you know, like most people think about inequality as this economic inconvenience for the people at the bottom, which is true, but it's much, much worse than that because, you know, as you pointed out in the beginning of the interview, from an anthropological perspective, which is a true perspective, humans are social creatures and status is incredibly important to us, probably more important than any other thing. And when you make a society super unequal, you effectively shred the reciprocity norms that make social cohesion and democracy possible. And that's why, like, it's worse than just like people can't afford to buy stuff, right?
Yeah.
It makes people insanely angry and irrational.
Well, you're absolutely right. There's an interesting kind of piece of this that I was reflecting on over the weekend while thinking about this interview, that, you know, the absolute, I guess, level of egregiousness of the inequality that we have is the biggest threat to the democracy that we have. Because to your point, it makes everybody angry at one another. And I think there's no better example of this than the response publicly to student loan forgiveness. And I just had this sense the entire time that was all unfolding, and the wrath and the fury and the rage that I'm seeing on social media from people that don't agree with this. I'm like, guys, we are all down here fighting with one another over who's getting what table scraps. Like, it's not left versus right. Look up at the people. They're having a 10-course meal up there, and we're fighting with each other over 10 grand. I'm like, give me a break. Like, but it totally makes sense because everyone so acutely feels like, oh my God, it's this zero-sum game. If I don't get mine now, I'm never going to. And if they have more, that means I have less.
Right.
But it's like, we're all fighting over really the little remnant of the pie that is left. And it would be much more effective to say, wait a second, like, but where did the rest of the pie go?
You know, over 10 years, this student loan forgiveness will cost, you know, sort of one of the things that's going on, of course, is that nobody can afford to pay these loans back. So they weren't going to get paid back anyway, right? A. And B, even if you assume that people could pay these loans back, you know, over 10 years, $250 billion, something like that. But sound like a lot of money? Not really, because for
not
perspective,
compared to what else we spend
American
on.
corporations, exactly, American corporations this year alone will spend $1.2 trillion, 6 times that amount, on stock buybacks alone. That's it.
Which are
like,
obviously creating
American
so much shareholder value.
Yeah. Like just $1.2 trillion on a straight up scam.
Yeah.
So people getting mad that, like, we're spending a tiny bit of money on middle class people, it within the context of what is truly going on at the top is so, like, it's so detached from the reality of what is really going on in our economy that it's super sad. If it had been me, I would have wiped out all the debt. I was just been like, no, it's all gone.
Hanauer 2024.
I mean, again, you know, the Republicans passed a $1.5 trillion tax cut in 2017, 85% of which went to the top 1%. If that's okay, why isn't wiping out $1.2 million of college debt for middle class people okay? Like, I mean, they're the same. spending the same amount of money. It's just who you're spending it on.
Who's it benefiting?
And
let's talk about that.
Yeah,
let's talk about taxes on the rich. So you said, I want to read you back a quote that I thought was so powerful. You said, raise taxes on the rich, and almost anything the federal government does with the revenue will pump more money through the economy than what the wealthy are doing with our hoarded cash today. Tax the rich to put money back in the hands of the American people through middle class tax cuts, and corporations will expand production and payroll to meet the resulting spike in consumer demand. Tax the rich to invest in roads, transit, bridges, healthcare, schools, and to transition to a green energy economy, and we will create millions of good-paying jobs while building the physical and human infrastructure on which our collective prosperity relies. Mic fucking drop. Why do modern economists have it wrong? You talked a little bit about this Pareto principle of equilibrium. Like, what is wrong with the way rich people treat their millions and billions? Why does taxing the rich create more jobs? And how can we as regular voters ensure that that happens?
Yeah, it's quite unbelievable. All of this comes back to economics and, you know, just how dumb it got. You know, for most economists, taxes are this dead weight loss it decreases efficiency or something like that. It's absolutely nuts. But your laziest government bureaucrat is still some restaurant's best customer. Like, if you stipulate that some bureaucrat out there, that, you know, kind of the canonical government worker that the government haters can point at as useless and blah, 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 they're still going to the grocery store. They're still getting haircuts. They're still going to restaurants. And, you know, some hedge fund dude spending $150 million on a painting and sticking it on their wall is not a productive use of funds, right? Like, it just isn't. And every dollar that we take from the truly rich and spend really in any other way is going to be economically more productive than what we're doing with it. I resemble
You're
that
like,
remark.
I would know.
I know. Yeah, I do know. And I'm not going to share with you how egregious my life is, but trust me, it is. And you know, it's indefensible. Relative to and not everything that you're going to do with that money is going to be stupid. A ton of it is going to be incredibly useful to the broader economy. And so, you know, of course, rich people should pay more tax. And I have this crazy idea. What I would do is raise the minimum wage to back to sort of former high watermark of about $24, $25 an hour. And then I would tie the minimum wage to the wages of the top 1%. Ooh. So you go, Ken Griffin, and make, you know, $3 billion. Everybody else comes along for the ride.
Yep.
You know, like, great, good on you. But you know, like, so the richer the rich get, the richer everybody gets, right? You basically tie the bottom and the top together so that you basically legislate that everyone will share in the benefits of economic progress. And I think that, to me, that's the way, if I ran the zoo, that's what I'd do.
It's funny. I think it's sometimes when I talk about taxing the rich in, you know, the personal finance content niche that I have, I'll get people that are like, well, the rich are rich because they deserve it and I don't want to be taxed more. I'm like, honey, you're not who we're talking about. You make $200,000 a year. Like, you're middle class like the rest of us. This isn't going to impact you at all.
Correct.
Like, and I do think that there's this misconception. I don't think people realize how rich the rich really are. Like, I think, wasn't there some study they did where they looked at, they asked average Americans, how bad do you think, you know, income or wealth inequality is in the US? And the numbers that most Americans thought was actually more reflective of Norway's wealth inequality, where the Gini index is like, I don't know, 22 or something, you know, to our 40. And
correct.
I just think people
were basically
don't actually
off by
understand.
a factor of 10.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's where there's some, like, it's almost just an awareness and education thing of like, no. We're not saying like, if you make $1 million, we're talking about people who make $500 million a year, $100 million a year. Like, there's almost no, you can't even conceive of how wealthy some of these people are. And not to say the economy is a zero-sum game, but to some degree it kind of is. Like, corporate profits are finite. Like, there is only, if somebody is getting paid $1 billion, that's money that probably could have been better spent on other things.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And, you know, the thing is that, okay, so coming back to neoliberalism and that way of thinking about economic cause and effect, how many times have you heard in your life that if you raise wages for, like, working people, it will kill jobs? Like,
the Big Mac is going to cost $20.
And there have been literally, and there have literally been thousands of studies now on the effect. I mean, there's just giant amounts of economic research on how many jobs or it turns out zero. The answer is zero. It didn't kill any
Yeah.
jobs, but how much this issue has been studied. But to my knowledge, not one economist in the entire world has ever run a study analyzing how many jobs Wall Street bonuses killed. Because here's the thing. If you add up, if you take, just add up the incremental compensation at the tippy top, hundreds of billions of dollars, and then say, instead of that, we spread that through the economy in $50,000 per year chunks, which is how much the average the median full-time worker in America makes.
Yep.
It's tens of millions of jobs. Mm-hmm. And the fact that this is what neoliberalism is that the evil part is not believing that when the rich get richer, that's good for the economy. The evil part is believing that when the poor get richer, that's bad for the economy. And the fact that infinite profits, infinite bonuses in this viewpoint and in the media are this unalloyed good. Like, well, okay, they earned a lot of money. That must be okay. Nobody ever says, well, maybe if you took some of that money and paid working people a little bit more, that would be better.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is the world we live in and what we're fighting against.
Well, I can't thank you enough for doing this work and for being here today. I really appreciate it. I've been shouting your message at Civic Ventures far and wide. So thank you for joining me and spending this time having this conversation.
Kind. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.